Thanks for joining us on our streaming service for your First Alert Avalanche forecast. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri. And joining me now is Brian Lazar from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Hey, Brian.
Hi, how you doing, Callie?
Good. Well, Brian, despite a really dry winter, it doesn't mean conditions are safe in the backcountry.
No, it's somewhat counterintuitive, right? So people think like a lack of snow might mean safer avalanche conditions, and this year it's not that case at all. And oftentimes really consistent deep snowpacks do lead to safer avalanche conditions. The problem with this year is we've had some storms here or there, but they're interrupted by these long dry spells. And anytime we get dry spells in Colorado and there's snow on the ground, we develop weak layers. And this year they've been particularly fragile. And so that has led to some pretty dangerous avalanche conditions. And what we saw essentially last week was, a little bit of snow, which led to, a big uptick in avalanche danger and avalanche hazard. And we saw some avalanche warnings even and widespread considerable avalanche danger across the state. We talked about last week that weak layer that was formed during the drought in early February was going to need some time to adjust, maybe a week. Here we are a week later, and we're starting to finally see signs that weak layer is slowly, ever so slowly gaining some strength. And so you can see a lot of that orange has disappeared from the map. We have widespread moderate avalanche danger across the state, but we remain in considerable avalanche danger in this area from right around Aspen, northwest through Summit County, including the southern front range around Loveland and Berthoud passes. And the reason is reflected right here. This is a map of avalanche activity over the last week. And you can see that area from essentially Summit County, from Breckenridge and the 10-mile range through Loveland, Berthoud passes has seen the most concentrated avalanche activity over the last week. And some of those are pretty impressive, which I'll show you in just a moment. What continues to drive the avalanche danger is our persistent slab avalanche problem. Those weak layers that formed have been incredibly fragile, particularly the one that we just buried in early February. And that's encompassing quite a bit of terrain. It's all slopes on the north and east side of the compass, essentially. And then the likelihood slider bar here is what's going to vary. And if you're in areas where we see considerable avalanche danger, it means triggering these avalanches are going to be likely. They're going to be easy for people to do on these suspect slopes. If you're in moderate avalanche danger, it just means that the likelihood, the chances of you triggering an avalanche have gone down. We're not seeing nearly as many signs of collapsing, cracking, shooting cracks, things that Mother Nature often gives us as obvious signs of instability. Those are waning in many places in the state, which means that these avalanches are less in your face, but they do remain possible to trigger. What has not changed, and what it doesn't really change depending on where you're going in the state, is the resulting size or consequences of these avalanche, which are now running anywhere from large to very large. And just to remind our listeners that large avalanches are big enough to bury, injure, or kill a person. Very large avalanches are big enough to kind of knock a car off the road. They're large enough to break trees, and these types of avalanches become very hard to survive. And so you can see the distribution of our persistent slab avalanche problem very closely matches our avalanche activity. So here's our avalanche activity over the last week across the state, and I highlighted here in red our most active aspects. So you can see it's northwest, and then all of our easterly facing slopes at all elevations essentially. And that's why we are warning people of cautious terrain travel, really conservative terrain choices on anything facing north or east as we move in and around avalanche terrain. Again, we have to point out that we are still warning of remote triggered avalanches. And so these are avalanches that are triggered from a distance. Here's a really good example of a snowmobiler up near Jones Pass, which triggered an avalanche from this flat spot, which propagated up into the slope above them.
Now, Brian, that slope doesn't look all that steep, and it looks really thin and really, really rocky.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point, because that's the other thing we want to warn people about for travel as we move in towards the weekend, is avoiding what we call trigger points. These are areas where you're more likely to trigger avalanches. And classic trigger points coincide with localized thin spots in the snowpack. So anytime you can identify, usually visually, just where you might see thin spots, that's where you're more likely to trigger an avalanche. In this case, very windswept, rocky terrain. And if we can avoid those trigger points, you can greatly reduce your chances of triggering an avalanche. Again, these avalanches are breaking anywhere from 2 to 4 feet deep on that February drought layer. And you can see some of them are breaking quite wide and really impressive. Here is an aerial shot of an avalanche on No Name Peak near Berthoud Pass. You can see just how wide this avalanche broke in some places, like on the left side of the photo, stepped down into some more deeply buried weak layers. If you look closely, you can see a track coming out of the avalanche debris. So although we don't know exactly what happened here, this certainly looks like yet another close call. And we do want to point out that just over the last week, we've had 7 documented incidents where people came into contact with moving avalanche debris involving 8 people. And unfortunately, this did not result in any serious injury or worse. Here's an example of just the consequences of these avalanches in the southern Gore Range, where a person triggered this avalanche from above. Again, look at how thin the snowpack is with all these localized shallow rocky spots. Again, here's a snowmobile triggered avalanche. 4 of those incidents that I just mentioned involve snowmobilers over the last week. This is out on the Grand Mesa. Again, triggered remotely. You can see the snowmobile tracks playing around in this really low angle terrain, but pulled out this steep slope overhead. So we do need to be very cognizant of steeper slopes above where we're traveling. And then here's an example of some pretty impressive avalanches right outside of Silverton in the San Juan Mountains. These ran naturally. You can see the one on the right ran first, and that sympathetically pulled out the second avalanche. And you can see as this debris gets going, if you can just envision being caught up in this avalanche debris, avalanches of these sizes are really hard to survive. Again, I want to point out that these are releasing in really thin windswept areas. Obviously, all this wind-scoured terrain across the ridgeline means that we've got thinner snowpack areas on these suspect slopes, and if we can really make a concerted effort to avoid these thinner snowpack areas, you can really reduce your chance of triggering an avalanche.
Now, Brian, more snow is on the way for the weekend. We are talking a foot of snow in some mountain locations, but the new snow is also expected to drive up avalanche danger.
Yeah, again, you know, it's really good to see the snowfall, but like these weak layers have really demonstrated that they should be treated guilty until proven innocent. Anytime we test these weak layers, they fail, and this is going to be no different. You can see we have a widespread 4 to 8 inches expected starting on Thursday night and lasting into late Friday. If we see the upper end of these forecast totals, we're going to see these weak layers fail yet again. They just have not held up to any test we've thrown their way. So you're going to expect to see rising avalanche danger, more areas of considerable avalanche danger, and some wind slab avalanches stacked on top of our persistent slab avalanche problem as we move into the weekend.
And Brian, how long do you think it'll take for this snowpack to stabilize after this next wave of snow moves through?
Yeah, you know, like all these recent and fluctuating warm temperatures have allowed that weak layer to slowly gain some strength. Again, as we bury these, they're probably going to fail yet again, just like we saw last week. And we talked about several days to a week before these things heal last week. We might be on a little bit better time curve this time around, but we're looking at probably 3 to 5 days before we start to see the more dangerous avalanche conditions start to stabilize and that weak layer gain strength and adjust to the loading event that we're going to see late this week.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, and we will see you back here next week for your First Alert Avalanche Report.